Meet Reid Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reid is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reid.
This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio. Hello, Rocky Mountains, KGAB AM and the Town Square Network serving the Intermountain West, KFEZ, EZ, Colorado Springs serving southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, and the Monster 780 AM Denver. Hello, New Mexico to Montana and Nebraska to Utah. And joining me today is Ryan Mauro. He's a National Security Analyst for the Clarion Project, and Clare Lopez. She's a senior fellow at the Clarion Project, a former CIA officer, and a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the Gatestone Institute. So we have folks on here who know a lot more than me and a lot more than you. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about, shall we say, the last 5, 6, 7 years of history in terms of terror in the United States from an Islamic extremist position. And then we're going to talk about this kind of, shall we say, tidal wave of events, Boston, Canada, et cetera. And finally, we're going to wind up, and I think this may be the most important question of the day, but you need the foundation to get there. And you're going to hear a lot of facts rather than the nonsense that's floating around the media from these two people who are experts. And where we're going to wind up is why. Why is our government behaving as it is toward its people? That would be the two folks I have on the phone here with me who are kind enough to join me today, myself and all of you listeners out there. Why can't they tell us the truth? Why can't they admit what is, and what are they doing about it? And we're going to include Benghazi in that discussion too, because it's all wrapped up, I think you'll see by the end of this show. And it's going to make you think, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to start off. Ryan, let me ask a question. And Claire, feel free to break in. This is an open forum. You know, let's go back to where would you start, would you say, the terror on Obama's watch? What would you think the first incident is?
Well, I would say the first incident of Islamic extremism would be as soon as he came into office, the people he surrounded himself with. There are many individuals tied to the U.S. branch of the Muslim Brotherhood that are even advising the Department of Homeland Security. Over at clarionproject.org, we've discovered that an advisor to the State Department, specifically the Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy, was the CEO of a group called the Islamic Relief USA, which the Israelis have arrested personnel from for financing Hamas, and the top leadership all supports Muslim Brotherhood, and there's just example after example of that. And so rather than just focusing on the violent tactics, I say we need to focus on the entire ideology and the proponents of that ideology. And unfortunately, some of the people that are connected to the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood network are advising the current government. They also advise the Bush administration, but it's happening for the Obama administration on a much greater level.
Yeah, you know, I interviewed Tawfiq Ahmed about 2 months ago. Folks, you can listen to that interview. You know, he's Egyptian and really knows his way around the Mideast. 10 high-ranking staff people in the White House. And the fact that actually in the White House now it's rumored to have daily prayer meetings. And it's not Christian or Jewish, shall we say Judeo-Christian type prayer meetings. Claire, let me ask a question. Talking about specific instances, because I think we know that there's a Muslim bent, shall we say, in the White House. We can read that in Barack Obama's own books. What would you consider to be the first event on his watch of, you know, Islamic extremist terrorism?
Well, I think Ryan laid out the basis very well there, the foundation of what this administration is comprised of and what it came into office to do. I would take issue a little bit with the word extremism or radical. What we are talking about is absolutely authoritative, mainstream, orthodox Islam. This is not extreme. It's no deviation from the norm or anything like that. This is what Islam is. Islam commands jihad against the non-believer. That jihad can be nonviolent. and it also can be violent. So if we want to go to what might be the first marker in the Obama administration, I would go to June 2009. That is when President Obama went to Cairo, Egypt, and gave his talk addressed to the Muslim world. That talk invited the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to the talk to sit in the front row, thereby deliberately, knowingly excluding the actual hosts for the visit, the then Mubarak regime, the Mubarak government. And I think green lighting the Islamic uprising that would follow so soon thereafter.
Let's assume you're correct. Did he give the green light on purpose in his speech in Cairo, or did he, shall we say, make the speech and that was the result and he didn't intend that or think that that would happen?
Well, given the follow-through by his administration, by the president personally, I cannot help but conclude that that was a very deliberate green light, and it was meant to trigger exactly what it triggered. And the follow-through in terms of arming, funding, supporting, backing all of these Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda militias was the carry-through, was the follow-through.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Ryan, do you agree with that assessment?
There's some things I do and some things that I don't, but I think that fundamentally the issue that we agree upon is how the Obama administration is approaching its foreign policy, and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. And there's really two pillars I think need to be discussed. First of all, that the Obama administration views the Muslim Brotherhood as moderate because the Muslim Brotherhood points to Al-Qaeda and says, look, we're better than those guys, and so by comparison they look moderate, and then you have the Muslim Brotherhood's apologists working in the Obama administration repeating that line. And I often say that calling the Muslim Brotherhood moderate compared to Al-Qaeda is like saying a rapist is moderate to a serial killer. It's just a matter of a few degrees. But I think that the big shift you saw in the Cairo speech is that there are two schools of thought in relation to radical Islam. The first school of thought, the one that the Obama administration subscribes to, is that our problems with Islamic extremism and terrorism results from anger over U.S. foreign policy and U.S. support for Israel, that this is based in politics, and that if they weren't so angry at us, that then they would be able to be reasoned with. And so the ball is in our court in order to reach an understanding with them. And then there is the second school of thought, the one that Claire and I belong to, which says that this is the result of a religious ideological doctrine that is being taught throughout the Islamic world. So, of course, you're going to be angry over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, over U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, over everything the United States does if you want to resurrect the caliphate, if you want to destroy Israel, and if you want to implement Sharia law. So there's a difference in cause and effect between people like Claire and I and then the Obama administration. And one of the things I'll point out is that back in 2008, then candidate Obama gave an interview to the New York Times where he said that his policy would be to convince Hamas and Hezbollah that their violence undercuts their, quote, legitimate claims. And I cannot believe that nobody asked Obama after that, well, what legitimate claims does Hamas and Hezbollah have?
Well, I don't really think you didn't expect the New York Times to dig into that statement, did you?
No, but I was hoping that the blogosphere would force some type of answer at some point.
Yeah,
nobody picked up on it.
I don't think anybody knew he was quite as bad as he was, although I had my suspicions. Look, going one step further, guys, do you think that Obama, and let's springboard off this. So his speech in Cairo, which he cloaked to the American people as our attempt to have a lasting and legitimate peace and blah, 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 all the rest of the cloaks that he used, was really kind of a intentional code, a go-ahead code to Muslim extremists throughout the Middle East. Assuming that's true, and the more I think about what Claire said, the more I think she's right on the button. But assuming that's true, does that also, can you take the step then that was also inviting terrorism in the United States?
You know, it wasn't deliberately inviting terrorism in the United States. That's. I don't believe that either President Obama or those in his administration actually want that to happen. But here we do have, in some sense, a cause and effect. By projecting a position of conciliation, of outreach. The administration left itself open to those for whom that is not the currency of international relations. This
I agree
is the way of
I agree with that 100%. 100%. And, you know, it's not too far off with other cultures also. So if you're correct on your first supposition, that it was a green light in Cairo for the Muslim Brotherhood et al. To rise up and seize power over there, and then you make the next step and you say, but they really don't want terrorism to occur in the United States, why then would we be talking about Fort Hood as workplace violence? Why would we be not interrogating the Christmas bomber, who came from an international flight, was obviously trained by Al-Qaeda, which he admitted later, and we're going to get into the current day mess over the last 2 weeks, but it would seem to me that Mr. Obama, having grown up in Muslim countries, having had a Muslim father, having had a Muslim stepfather, having written in his own books that the finest sound in the world is the call to prayer in the morning, et cetera, folks you can go to his book, go to Amazon, type in the words on that little free read you get. You can read it for yourself. His words, not mine. Taking all that together, what makes you think, Claire, and Ryan, chime in, what makes you think that Mr. Obama is all that upset about terrorism in the United States?
Well, here is my take on this. I think there is another kind of a worldview out there, and it goes like this. If we, the United States and our Western partners, are conciliatory about Islam, and we call it, we don't call it by name, which is Islam. It is not Islamism. It's not Islamist. It's Islam. It is doctrine, law, and scripture of Islam. The people who are faithful to it are Muslims. They're not Islamists. They're Muslims until they prove themselves otherwise. But there's this worldview that the vast majority of Muslims who do not participate in violent jihad, or perhaps any other kind either, and that is the vast majority in this world, may they be fruitful and multiply, would somehow be offended if we called Islam by its name, if we called terrorism by its name, which is jihad, and that somehow we can appeal to that vast majority of nonviolent Muslims, and we won't alienate them if we peddle the soft vocabulary, if we peddle the soft linguistics that says, we know that most of you don't believe in this stuff and you don't take part in this stuff. I don't know how we know they don't believe it, but this is how the worldview goes. Then we can count on them to be our allies, and they will help us to root out those who are violent. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood in the West has not been violent, quite to the opposite in Egypt and places like Syria, of course, where they're extremely violent. But in the West, they've not been so violent as over there. Al-Qaeda has. So here goes the thinking, if you can call it thinking. We'll appeal to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has precisely the same objectives as Al-Qaeda, reestablish the caliphate, and enforce Islamic law, Sharia. It's just that they go about it through more sophisticated subterfuge kind of methods, meaning civilization jihad in their own words, or
right. And don't they have a whole manual out on that?
They certainly do. There's something called the methodology of dawah. It might be that you're thinking of, written by...
Why don't you just spell that for the audience and tell them where they can find a copy? Well,
the methodology of dawah, D-A-W-A, sometimes you'll see that with an H on the end. The author of this particular essay, it's kind of a monograph, is Shamim Siddiqui, S-H-A-M-I-N, Siddiqui, S-I-D-D-I-Q-I, or Q-U-I, sorry. But you can find it online. If you Google methodology of dawah, this will pop up. It is an essay written in, if I'm not mistaken, 1989 by a Muslim brother who was laying out exactly how the Muslim Brotherhood would use the support structures of Western society, meaning academia, the media, organizations, professional organizations like organizations of engineers and lawyers and scientists and so forth, to infiltrate a society from within, build its case, its structure within the society by stealth, and then eventually one day be strong enough to overthrow it. This is how the Muslim Brotherhood is viewed. And so this worldview, again, goes, well, they're working within society. They're not frontally attacking it with planes going into tall buildings, so let's appeal to them. And then all these other hundreds of millions of Muslims who don't partake in violent jihad, they'll think we're good people because we're working with those that say they're nonviolent. In fact, they're pre-violent, but let that go. And they'll come over to our side and they'll help us root out the really violent ones, and then we'll be fine.
Yeah, but let's go back to what Ryan said. I mean, that infiltration in the United States includes now high-ranking advisory positions in numerous agencies and departments, including security agencies, including national security departments, and in the White House itself. So what we really come down to, I mean, if you boil it all down, Ryan, chip in, is that we are being fed a bill of goods by our government on how, listen, if we take this kind of soft approach, everything will get better. And the words that they are telling us are from the very people who want to kill us. Correct?
Sure. And yes, that is correct. And I think that Claire properly articulated the worldview of the current administration, their attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood, because they're focusing on a tactic, the violent tactic of terrorism. And since the Muslim Brotherhood participates in elections, forget about the objective that they use freedoms in order to destroy freedoms, but because they participate in elections and because they are willing to accept a little bit more of Western culture than an Al-Qaeda terrorist, and because they're smooth with the media, and because they condemn 9/11, that they are the moderate force that we're working for. And so the Obama administration viewed them as a source, as the movement for change in the Middle East, which they actually were and are, because they hold all the grassroots networks on the ground and all the infrastructure. They decided to ally with that movement for change because, again, the focus is on tactic and it's not on ideology. And one of the important things that Claire said is that the U.S. believed that this was the way to appeal to the majority of Muslims who don't believe in this type of ideology and don't believe in terrorism, but actually what it has done has alienated them, because the Muslims that stand against the Muslim Brotherhood, they want to be backed against the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want the U.S. to have a neutral stance. And instead what they hear from the United States is that we're legitimizing the Muslim Brotherhood, indeed in some ways acting as their PR agent, by calling them moderate, by reassuring the world public that they're good guys that are going to maintain the peace treaty with Israel, and then the Muslims that are brave enough to stand against them say, where is the United States? And today, over at clarionproject.org, I did a webinar with two devout Muslims that are engaged in fighting the Muslim Brotherhood ideologically, and that's exactly what their message was. And if you're looking for a modern example of this type of policy in action, look to Syria, because the media and U.S. officials were very happy when the Syrian opposition chose as their interim rebel prime minister an American, and everyone said, oh, that's amazing, it's an American. And prominent Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations in the United States, people that have called for changing the Constitution of America, endorsed him. And the media just reported that and said, look, this is great. They chose an American, they chose a moderate, they chose someone that the top Muslim American leadership in the United States endorses. Great guy. But if they had listened to the Muslims in Syria that were standing against them, individuals like Kamal Lobwani, who are secular and democratic and say Islam needs to be reformed, they walked out of the vote. They said, this American is being supported by the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. We want nothing to do with him. Where is the United States? And that story is barely even told, that you had Muslims walking out of the vote for the rebel prime minister because they said the fix is in, the U.S., Qatar, and the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood have chosen who they want to lead the Syrian opposition. Now what do we do?
Yeah, and on a macro scale, everybody who is listening to this show saw Barack Obama leave the Green Movement dangling in the wind in 2009 in Iran. I mean, once again, that was a more secular moderate uprising against a truly dangerous Orthodox regime, a theocracy in Iran, and despite public cries for his help and support, he did nothing. Zero.
Apparently our president and this administration only intervene when they can intervene on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda or both. They will not intervene on the side of forces, genuine forces, as Ryan pointed out, in Syria. They exist in Lebanon. They exist in Egypt and every other place in the Middle East to intervene and support them. But that doesn't happen. And it's not just this administration. The U.S. government institutionally has failed to do this, and so have, for that matter, private organizations, including academia and non-governmental organizations, failed to identify and back and support the genuine voices of pro-West, pluralist, tolerant, liberal democracy, as few and as beleaguered as they may be in the Middle East. But we have failed to do that. And now in places like Syria and Libya and Egypt, it's too late. It's too late. We intervene on the side of Al-Qaeda and of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, when did U.S. policy flip like this to where we are actually sending weapons, money, training to Al-Qaeda militias as well as Muslim Brotherhood militias?
Well, I think it was a cold, windy day in January 2009 when he raised his hand and swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and defend it from all enemies, domestic and foreign. I think it was that day. But why, if, Claire, you're correct, and Ryan, break in, why, if you're correct that Barack Obama and his minions are truly upset, horrified, mortified, and wish to end any terrorism within the borders of the United States, why would they call Fort Hood workplace violence? Why would they arm twist the mainstream media to basically sweep under the rug Muslim extremism, which killed 2 soldiers at the recruiting station in Arkansas a year before Hassan? Why would they do that?
Because I think these things are an embarrassment. I think that repeated incidences of these kinds of Islamic Jihad terrorist attacks in the United States, all those examples you just mentioned, the Little Rock recruiting station, Fort Hood, even foiled plots that luckily were stopped in time, like New York Times Square, not so good, not so lucky Boston Marathon, and now, of course, the most recent plot, thanks to our Canadian buddies, and maybe some assistance from the U.S. side, stopping the rail line attack over the Niagara River. These are embarrassments. Why? Because they show, and especially they show when the defendants, when the suspects or the accused are brought before a court and they say out loud, I did this for Islam. When a Major Nidal Hassan is shouting, Allahu Akbar, as he's gunning down his military comrades at Fort Hood, this is an embarrassment. Why? Because it shows that there is no such thing as moderate Islam, radical Islam. There is only Islam. There is only the authoritative doctrine of Islam that is approved by the scholars. Many, many Muslims maybe do not follow it, maybe they disobey, maybe they condemn it, but that is the doctrine, no matter what the people do. The doctrine remains the doctrine, and it's an embarrassment to the administration, as well as being, of course, a failure on the part of security services, including CIA, FBI, DHS, and maybe even local law enforcement, too. But maybe you'll get to this, and maybe this is another topic to head into. That failure, that very failure by those national security forces that causes this embarrassment to the administration is almost made inevitable by the purge that we have undergone in this country in government training courses, in curricula that are supposed to teach about where Islamic terrorism comes from. It comes from Islamic doctrine, law, and scripture. But you're not allowed to say that, teach that, train that anymore, and literally training courses have been scrubbed of all such linkages over the past several years. Goes back before this administration. Let's not make this a partisan issue. But they have been scrubbed, and that that is contributing to the inability of our services like the FBI to understand what it means when the Russians come to them repeatedly and say, hey, this guy, the older Tsarnaev brother, Tamerlane, is becoming more religious, more devout. The Russians know what they mean. That means he's turning towards jihad. The FBI has no training anymore. They have no context in which to put that. They say becoming more religious, becoming more devout as a Muslim. Oh, that must be like a Presbyterian. He's going to church on a regular basis now. And so, okay, next page. That's what the cause is, and that's what the result is.
Go ahead, Ryan.
And I think the other part of the equation is that the Obama administration, because they don't want to be bothered with foreign entanglements and foreign wars, and they have a domestic focus, there has been a concerted effort to narrow down what we call the war on terror, because they want to focus just on Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda Central specifically. So if someone is inspired by Al-Qaeda, that's an ideological problem, and that's something that you can't really deal with. They focus on drone strikes in Pakistan to destroy the Al-Qaeda leadership and less on the ideology. So when Fort Hood gets shot up, why would that be an incident of workplace violence to them? Because to them, they would argue that's not really a terrorist attack because it wasn't an Al-Qaeda operation. He wasn't dispatched by Ayman al-Zawahiri and have a network on the ground. He only did it on his own accord because they would probably argue he's crazy, but because he was inspired by the doctrine that he was exposed to. And so there's a difference in how you define a terrorist attack. I think that most people that are realistic about this problem would understand that someone that acts on their own accord but is inspired by a certain doctrine to engage in this terrorist activity is a terrorist. But I find that some people also they define terrorist attack as meaning, was it part of an organization? Were you part of a network? And that's their way of dancing around what's a terrorist attack and what isn't. And that's why Vice President Biden said that amazing comment last year where he said the Taliban per se is not our enemy. The only reason he can say that is because they're focusing just on Al-Qaeda. To them, the Taliban is only our enemy as far as they work with Al-Qaeda. If they break off their links with Al-Qaeda, then they're no longer our enemy. That's the mindset that we're dealing with.
But
Reid, this is where I think we come back to the vocabulary again. If we named the perpetrators of these attacks for what they are, which is jihadists, then we would get to both the ideological and the practical aspects of the attacks. We would understand what the ideology is because jihad, of course, according to Islamic law, is warfare to spread Islam, quote unquote, from the books of law. And it is something that we look at, of course, as terrorism. But, of course, Muslims wouldn't call it terrorism. Muslims call jihad jihad. Terrorism is something that bad people do. Muslims think that. Muslims say that, even though terrorism is called for in the Quran explicitly multiple times. But what they mean by when they say jihad is what we mean when we say terrorism. But if we use the proper terms and say jihad by Muslims, then we would get past all of this. Well, are they linked to Al-Qaeda or are they not? Does Al-Qaeda still exist? Is the Central Core still extant?
Yeah, well, we're in complete agreement, Claire, but progressives are masters at twisting words and taking dire diabolicals and turning them into warm fuzzies, at least in people's minds. That doesn't change the reality. The bottom line is that all the deals that we just talked about were, even going back to, shall we say, I don't want to call it your defense of the administration, Ryan, but going back to their focusing on Al-Qaeda, virtually all of them had some Al-Qaeda linkage, some Al-Qaeda inspiration. Hassan was emailing back and forth with the American cleric that wound up over there, kind of the second in command of Al-Qaeda. And, the Christmas bomber was trained by Al-Qaeda. The underwear bomber, they helped him actually develop the bomb, which fortunately didn't go off. So, we can go through all these points, and in one way, shape, or form, they all go back to Al-Qaeda or its spider web. And its spider web, I would have to argue, would include the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I see them shoulder to shoulder.
Well, in reverse, actually, because Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes, exactly. It was their militaristic arm not too long ago, was it not?
Well, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, today number 1, previously number 2 to Osama bin Laden, came together in the middle 90s to coalesce together and form Al-Qaeda. But, it was people who originally were Muslim brothers. Osama bin Laden was a brother before he was Al-Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri was a brother before he was Al-Qaeda. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a brother before he was Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. So they stand shoulder to shoulder. I mean, in my world, there's really no differential between them other than the monikers, shall we say. Let's talk about, for a moment, Iran. Because, quite interestingly, Al-Qaeda in Iran, which, of course, Iran denies, and, of course, Iran's not building a bomb either, but Al-Qaeda in Iran kind of set up, trained, and, shall we say, directed the foiled plot by the terrorists between the Canadians and Americans on the railway. And, this is in the last week. What's going on with Iran in this? And, how does that kind of tie in this administration's reluctance to put their foot down, to support Israel, who, of course, they would not consider to be a friend given their, shall we say, Muslim tolerance? How does that all tie into this?
Well, I think we need to go back a bit in time if we're going to take this sort of a historical overview.
Let's do it.
And go back to the early 1990s in the Sudan. The Afghan war had ended by that point. Osama bin Laden had left Afghanistan, so did Ayman al-Zawahiri. They fetched up in Sudan, where the president then is the president now. His name is Umar al-Bashir, gave them sanctuary. And there they set up training camps and established themselves for a number of years. But the other thing that they did while they were there, and this is under the aegis of President Bashir, is invite all the other jihadis of the world to kind of like a great big jihad jamboree in Khartoum in the early 1990s. Late 1990 into the beginning of 1991 was the beginning. And among all those PLO, PFLP, and so forth, everything else that they invited, whom else did they invite? The top leadership of the government of Iran. Coming to Khartoum were then President Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the head of Iranian intelligence at the time, Ali Falahian, the head of the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps at the time, Mohsen Rezai, current top advisor to the current Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. That guy then was with the IRGC, Ahmed Veliati. All of these came to Khartoum, met with Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and bin Laden says to the Iranians, he says, I really like what your Hezbollah boys do with explosives, referring back to the 1980s and especially 1983 attack on the American-French embassies and, of course, our Marine barracks there. And Osama bin Laden said, to the Iranians, can you assign some of your guys to teach my guys how to do explosives like that, suicide bombs, truck bombs, big bombs that bring down buildings? And the Iranians said, yeah, sure. And whom did they assign? Imad Mughniya. Imad Mughniya, top terror chieftain of Hezbollah, of course, an Iranian, at that time, wholly owned subsidiary, created, armed, funded, trained by the Iranians. Imad Mughniya goes to work for Al-Qaeda, sets up training camps in Sudan, Lebanon, Bekaa Valley, other places, Iran too. He taught the Al-Qaeda guys how to do explosives. Out of that came the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing. That was a joint effort. 1998 East Africa embassy bombings, joint effort. Hezbollah trained the explosives, Al-Qaeda carried it out. 2000 USS Cole, the ship attack in Yemen, joint effort. 9/11, joint effort. This is Al-Qaeda and Iran working together, and so many attacks since then. In the wake of 9/11, when the Shura was founded in Iran. I mean, the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan went fleeing in a number of different directions. One shore was set up in the Afghan-Pakistan border region in the mountains. Another was set up in the Pakistani cities like Quetta. And the third shore was set up inside Iran. It is functioning to this day. It is not under house arrest. It is an operational, terrorist operational, coordinated relationship. Ayman al-Zawahiri has maintained personal, close relationships with all of the successive Iranian intelligence chiefs to this day. That's the background.
So, Ryan, let me ask a question. Now, are our boys in Washington and our field operatives who, I give all credence to, I don't give any credence to our boys in Washington. I give all credence to the field operatives, or most of them. Are they just stupid, or do they know this?
Well, I think that the reason there's even an argument about whether Shiite extremists and Sunni extremists cooperate, whether Iran and Al-Qaeda cooperate, comes down to pride and analysts that have built their career on the belief that they do not, that they hate each other so much that they're not willing to cooperate against the common enemy and put aside their differences. And so for a very long time, you had many analysts arguing, and it became political. So they'll hear about the facts that Claire just presented, which are very well documented, and there's many more on top of that. It's a solid case. But because if you're working in the intelligence community or you're working in policy circles, if time and time again you have put your credibility on the line by saying that Shiites and Sunnis won't cooperate against the common enemy, then you're going to be resistant to that point of view, and you're going to criticize those that are on the opposite side. And we just saw that happen in the recent plot where the Al-Qaeda network in Iran was linked to the plot to derail a train that was going from New York to Toronto.
Exactly.
Because and here's how it was played. An anonymous, of course, an individual that wouldn't give his name, an anonymous U.S. government official started talking to the press, and his message was that we can't blame Iran for this, even though Al-Qaeda is in their borders, because they may not control their activities, they may not have any control over them, and they made it sound like Al-Qaeda was just like a small gang inside of Iran that escaped the powers of the police and the monitoring. But we know that that's not true, because as Claire outlined, Al-Qaeda's been operating there for a very, very long time. The Iranian regime monitors their population. They were able to crush a popular uprising against them. And we're to believe, based on the words of this anonymous government official, that Iran has the capability of crushing their own population rising up against them, but is unable to crush an Al-Qaeda cell that's operating in their own territory. And it doesn't make any sense, especially when the U.S. government has specifically and publicly named the Al-Qaeda leaders that are in Iran, sanctioned them, and said where they're located. And we're supposed to believe that Iran doesn't have any responsibility for what Al-Qaeda does within its own country. It's really incredible, but when the anonymous official was able to spin the media coverage that way, what you saw was that battle within the Beltway taking place. Someone that was trying to curb public opinion and curb media coverage in order to fit the way he analyzes the problem, which is incorrect.
I think you're exactly right there, Ryan. If I could really quickly throw out a website for the listeners.
Absolutely.
If you want to see more about what we're just talking about here, or the Iran-Al-Qaeda relationship, have a look at something called the Havlish legal case. I happen to have been an expert witness in this case. The judge put all the documents, ordered them all online, and the legal team, we put the documents online. That website is www.iran911case.com, iran911case.com, and there is an actual legal case with a ruling from Judge George Daniels, Southern District of New York, December 2011. After all the evidence we presented, he ruled that Iran shared co-responsibility with Al-Qaeda and with Hezbollah for the attacks of 9/11. And sometime a bit later assigned actually a financial damages award to that ruling. This is a federal district court has ruled that Iran was responsible for 9/11.
Just out of curiosity,
Zero response from our government.
Did Iran ever pay the?
No.
The judge.
No, they did not defend in court.
And what I thought was amazing about that is that ruling changed our understanding of 9/11. It should really be in the history books. It completely changed the history of 9/11, its origins, just everything we understood about it. And I think I saw one article somewhere in the New York Times that was very small. It got no coverage.
I'll tell you, I'm going to have you folks back on because there are a number of tangents we're not going to hit today, and one of them is the infiltration via education. Now, let's flash forward to the events of the last 2 weeks. So we have this horrific event in Boston. Then we have on its heels the foiled event in Canada/U.S., a train crossing the border. And we also have, it's just coming out kind of in dribs and drabs, and you got to wonder about what kind of filters it's going through and what the real purpose of the information is, because I think we have a very manipulative administration. But we're now hearing that the next target was New York, Times Square, that they had more bombs, etc. And now we have, after the government itself, I mean, people can Google this up all they want, high-ranking officials in the government saying, well, we have 48 hours, under this public safety clause, et cetera, and then suddenly a U.S. magistrate appears in a hospital room in the middle of an FBI interrogation approximately 32 hours prior to the expiration of the 48-hour period and reads the kid his rights and he shuts up. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. Somebody doesn't want him to talk.
I think you're spot on. That is exactly the way I read it as well. It was shortly after this is the younger brother, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, began talking about his motives, their motives, his and of his bigger brother, Tamerlane, and said, we did it for Islam. Oh, can't have that. Read him his rights. Get him lawyered up. It's amazing to me to see these suspects appearing in court or answering to interrogation, and one after the other comes straight out, flat out, and says, we did it for Islam. One of those arrested up in Canada appeared in court, I think it was just yesterday. This is Cheheb Essengayer, the Tunisian, who, by the way, very troublingly, to me anyway, worked at a bio-nanotechnology laboratory. But he appears in court yesterday and flat out to the judge says, I don't believe in your law. Your law is not God-given. Only Allah's law rules on earth. He is flat out saying he's legally in Canada, legally there, that he is not obedient. His allegiance is not to Western or man-made law. His allegiance is to Sharia. They tell us. They don't mince words. They tell us straight out.
Okay, and then we have in the Boston bombing. Additionally, we now have this really conflicting testimony, assertions, disassertions, disassociations, finger pointing. The administration trying to kind of stay aloof from it as they do, so deniable culpability. And in the meantime, the FBI, the poor FBI guys are out there getting hammered on they didn't do this, they didn't do that. You folks work at a large institute. You've worked in large organizations. I'm a small businessman. Would you agree that corporate culture begins at the top? I mean, I don't care what kind of organization it is. It's the top, shall we say, echelon of management that creates the corporate culture, that creates the attitude, that creates, shall we say, the public face and public response to events and circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that it reflects back to what Claire was saying earlier regarding the counterterrorism training, how any references to Islam or Jihad or anything Islamic was removed from the key national security documents that formed the backbone of our policy as soon as the Obama administration came in. And then that set the stage for all of these other problems that we're having in fighting the ideological war. And in regards to the counterterrorism training materials, I think it's telling to point out how the U.S. branch of the Muslim Brotherhood made that happen. They first were able to get into advisory positions to the Department of Homeland Security and to the Obama administration in various sectors. And then when it came out that the Third Jihad, which is our film that is available for free at clarionproject.org, it was discovered that the NYPD was using the Third Jihad and showing it to their officers, and groups like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, didn't like that because we tell the truth about them. They started staging rallies and protests and saying that the NYPD was using this anti-Muslim hate film, even though it's narrated by a devout Muslim. But, of course, they don't tell you that part. And then they got the New York Times on their side. And then that led to more revelations about the content of training materials, and then they used that to call for a complete review of all of the counterterrorism training documents that are used across the board. Once they're able to get that review begun, then you have to have someone advising the review. You have to bring in experts. And who are the experts from? Groups like the Islamic Society of North America, a U.S. Muslim Brotherhood entity. And that whole campaign, that successful campaign of influence by the U.S. branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, I think has to be a case study in how they operate, how they use terms like Islamophobia, and they call people an anti-Muslim bigot as a way to force the hands of elected officials and unelected officials that serve in government and get put in a position where they actually get to review our own training materials.
Well, listen, it's really the same tactics progressive use on a social schedule, right? While they're not reviewing displaced, shall we say, lost in the files Muslim training programs, the Department of Homeland Security is busy compiling lists of possible threats to the United States. At the top of the list are conservatives, returning veterans, evangelicals. Above, I might add, I think Al-Qaeda on their list, folks. Go online, dial it up, Department of Homeland Security, terrorist threats, subversive groups. You can read their own report. Al-Qaeda's number 8. Evangelical Christians are number 1. Now, something is really cattywampus in this world. Here's where I come down, folks. In my heart of hearts, I don't believe that terrorism in the United States is that much of a concern to this administration. I think they almost look at it as a fulcrum that they can use to further their own ideological ends. And whether or not that has a Muslim bent or whether it's simply a pure progressive bent, that's what I think. Your opinions?
I don't think you're wrong, Reid. I think this is definitely a Linskyite in nature. Never let a good crisis go to waste.
He who gives up liberty in pursuit of security shall wind up with neither. That's a great quote. So, to kind of wrap this whole thought up, folks, what exactly can people, at the street level do? And what can they expect over the next year or 2 years in terms of terrorism within the borders of the United States and from this government in terms of at least someone, somewhere? I don't know if it's in the military. I don't know if it's, somewhere in the Justice Department, which has been kind of ransacked and gutted. But someone somewhere standing up and going, wait a minute, this is the enemy. This is what we need to do to defeat them, and take those steps. In other words, basically call it for what it is, and take the steps to eliminate the problem. Because you can't eliminate a problem until you admit the problem exists.
Sure. Well, personally, I'm not going to say that Obama doesn't care about Americans getting killed on American soil. I'm just not willing to go that far. I have an issue with his policy viewpoints and the strategy, but I'm not going to say he doesn't care if Americans get killed. But in regards to what you're saying in regards to the ideology and what we're going to see, I think that the Boston bombings might be a turning point because people are going to recognize that this is just such a vicious attack, and if there is just not enough honesty to connect it to ideology at all and to Islamic doctrine, then individuals and just people all across the board are going to get incredibly frustrated, and you're not going to be able to have credibility if you can't bring yourself to say that this was motivated by at least an interpretation of Islam that these two brothers held. So I think that this could be a turning point, but we have to make sure it's a turning point. And that's why I encourage all of your viewers and all of your listeners to go to clarionproject.org and watch The Third Jihad, which Claire is in, and watch it for free and show it to your friends, your family, show it to your church and your synagogues, political clubs, whatever, so that this opportunity can become a teaching moment, so that something good can come out of this disastrous moment.
And raise hell with your legislators and get them to watch it too, folks, on every level of government. Ryan, if Barack Obama cared that much about the American people, I think it's basic human nature to say that if I have an enemy that wants to kill me, I need to either take that enemy out or I need to defend against that enemy. I mean, only those two, and I prefer the first myself, but that's my nature. But only those two actions can, in the end, secure your security or the security of the people whom you represent. Yet neither one of those steps are being taken.
Well, so, he is killing the Al-Qaeda leadership in Pakistan. You can't make it sound like he hasn't done anything, but I think that he honestly believes...
That's a diversion. I think he does it just so he can say he's doing it. So
no, I don't believe that he's an evil man. I don't believe he's evil and doesn't care if Americans get killed. But the reason that he's not taking action against the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, comes from a profound misunderstanding that's very common among government officials and in academia. There's a surprisingly large amount of people that believe the Muslim Brotherhood is truly moderate just because they participate in elections and they don't engage in violence on American soil. It's a very common viewpoint.
Claire, what's your opinion?
Reid, I'll second what you were saying and also what Ryan was saying about where we need to go, how we need to stand up to this. And I'll add my thanks here at the end of the interview to you, because what you're doing is to help get the word out about what is facing us, the threat from Islam, from Islamic Jihad and Sharia. And that's where it starts. It starts with education at the grassroots level. If you're going to talk about the leadership of this country, it is gone. National security leadership is gone. It belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood on these issues related to the Middle East and Islam belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood. The information loop is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. The output of U.S. foreign policy on these issues, dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Inside the Beltway, gone. We must go down to the grassroots, and that's where radio shows like yours can be so very helpful. It's up to we the people at this point. And what can we the people do? Educate, first of all, by going to some of these websites we looked at, clarionproject.org again, and some of the other ones we've thrown out there. Reading things. I'll mention the book of the Team B2 report that we wrote together at the Center for Security Policy, Sharia, The Threat to America. Look at Frank Gaffney's 10-part video series online, the Muslim Brotherhood in America.org. And then get active. Once informed, it's time to get active. Citizens, to be true good citizens, not only must be informed, they must be involved citizens. What does that mean? Interact at the local level with your media. Interact with those whom you would like to support that would run for government office, local level, regional, statewide, and on up to Congress. And then for those who are already in these positions, let them know what you think. Call them, email them. Let them know where you stand on these issues and that you expect them to listen to your point of view, to understand and learn just as much as you, the people, are learning. And if they don't do that, the next elections will have consequences. That's the main thing for I think, average citizens.
And Claire, one last point. I'm going to ask you one last question, then we're going to wrap up. So let's face it. The Muslim Brotherhood wouldn't be in the White House, wouldn't be advising the security agencies of the United States without tacit, if not complicit, approval by the people at the top. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay. The Muslim Brotherhood is undermining our defenses. The result is an increasing number of attempts at terror and, unfortunately, as we saw with Boston and we saw with Fort Hood, an increasing number of successful attempts at terrorism. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so if you take those two things, the guys who are responsible for allowing this to happen, because the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic extremist, and I realize your position is it's Islam. In my world, it's the extremes on the fringe of that religion, no matter what the Quran may say. But the bottom line is that these people allow or facilitate this occurring. So my last question to you before we get off is, is it intentional?
Yes, in some sense it is intentional. To this extent, the worldview of many of our leaders at the top right now is that the United States is a force for evil in the world, that we are a force for instability, for oppression of the downtrodden, et cetera, you know the litany. And that the remedy for that imbalance in the world is that the United States be diminished in military power, diminished in political power. That is the core agenda of those in leadership positions right now. It's not necessarily that they want Americans killed, no, but they do want the United States of America as a power in the world to be diminished.
And I'm going to close out the show by reminding the audience, here's 3 dots for you. Barack Obama's book. He talks about the colonial powers. The colonial powers, by the way, in his mind, the big colonial power is the United States, and the little colonial power is Israel. Then, go to my interview of Dinesh D'Souza last fall. He wrote an entire treatise and researched it for 4 years on 3 continents. And he talks about Obama's abhorrence of, quote-unquote, colonial powers. Then read the transcripts. You'll have to search for it because they're busy blotting them out of the websites, of the initial interviews and leaks with the Boston bombing kid. And you'll see that he said the words, America is a colonial power. I'll let the audience connect those dots. Folks, it's been terrific. I'm going to have you back real soon. Thank you for your time. This is Reid Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio. Cheyenne and Colorado Springs and Denver and 7 states up and down the Rocky Mountains. We'll see you next Saturday.
For more information about Reid and his work, please go to ontherightsideradio.com. There you can also click to purchase the first 2 volumes of his #1 best-selling historical Western series, Threads West, An American Saga, and Maps of Fate. And now the first volume of his new nonfiction series, Land for Love and Money, is available everywhere, or go to landforloveandmoney.com. That's Land for Love and Money. We'd also like to remind you that if you've missed any shows, you can go to the show archives on Reid's ontherightsideradio.com webpage. We look forward to seeing you again next week for another episode of Reid Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.